I'm really pleased to be hosting for tonight for the next edition of our Hidden Truth Stories of Race and Place series. This is a year-long series and maybe even longer than that because we are having such incredibly meaningful conversations and getting such great audiences and taking advantage of an incredible opportunity to showcase the talent and the wisdom and knowledge of so many members of our community, from faculty to alums and all kinds of other stuff all kinds of other folks who are involved in the Roger Williams University adventure. So I am going to hand things over in just a second to our provost, Dr. Margaret Everett, who will be introducing our speaker. I wanted to let you know that we'll be using the chat feature for questions. Feel free to enter questions into the chat at any point during the presentation. What we'll do is after Julian Bonder is finished with his presentation, I'll be looking over the chat and I will sort of gather together your ideas and questions and present them to him just to make things a little bit more efficient. But please do start entering your thoughts and your questions into the chat as soon as you have them, and we will definitely make time for those questions and answers at the end. So without further ado, our provost, Dr. Margaret Everett.
Thank you so much, Jason. And it's really a pleasure. I'm so pleased to be with all of you this evening, and especially to be able to introduce Professor Julian Bonder. I'm really looking forward to hearing his presentation tonight and learning more about his work as we continue this important series, which I've so enjoyed and learned from. And I agree with Jason. I hope that we keep this going. It's really been terrific, thought-provoking, and I think really necessary. But I'm thrilled to introduce Julian Bonder, who is a teacher, designer, and registered architect born in New York and raised in Argentina. He's a professor of architecture, of course, at Roger Williams University, and a principal of Julian Bonder and Associates, and a partner at Wadishko and Bonder, I hope I pronounced that correctly, Architecture, Art, and Design, both in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He's an active contributor to international debates on memory, architecture, art, and representation, historic trauma, and the design of public spaces, monuments, and memorials. His work is often found outside the traditional boundaries of architecture and has received numerous awards, has been widely published and exhibited worldwide. Bonder's work and proposals about Argentina's desaparecidos, civil rights, the Holocaust, September 11th, and slavery include the Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Clark University, and with Wadishko, the Memorial to the Abolition of Slavery in Nantes, France, which we're going to hear about tonight, which has received more than 1.5 million visitors and earned a special mention at the European Prize for Urban Public Space, and was shortlisted for the European Prize for Contemporary Architecture, Mies van der Rohe Award. Professor Bonder's work, in fact, has been recognized by numerous awards, too many to mention tonight, but I did want to say most recently with the ACSA Honorable Mention in just a few weeks ago in 2021 for his work on the Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King Memorial in Boston, which we are just so thrilled to celebrate with Professor Bonder, and so proud of his many accomplishments. So with that, it is really a pleasure to turn it over to Professor Bonder, and I look forward to hearing his presentation tonight.
Well, thank you so much, Jason. Thank you so much, Laura, for organizing kind of this series of talks. Thank you, Provost Everett, for the introduction and the invitation. And I want to also thank my friend and Dean, Steve White, for his continued and ongoing support to many of our endeavors. And I want to thank all my friends, who are here, colleagues from our school and students, and all of you for taking some time to join in and to have a kind of a lively conversation about some of these issues. Partly what I wanted to share with you is a little bit of the structure of how I intend to kind of present the work. I've been told that I have about 2.5 hours to do my presentation, so I'm going to take a little less than that. No, just kidding. But also I want to thank Professor Bosco for her leadership at school, at the university. So great to see all of you here. So what I will do is I will go very, very quickly through some concepts, some ideas that relate to this issue of public space, memory, democracy, ethics, questions of representation. And I will do that showing lots of images that will serve a little bit as a background to the conversation. Then I will show a bit more specifically a couple of projects, and I will center at the end on the memorial to the abolition of slavery in Nantes, France, that you can see as part of my background, in this Zoom background that we can craft, that's the space of the memorial. So to begin, let me do share screen. If I can make it work. Okay. So before I start with the share screen, I just want to say that part of this work, just give me 1 second, it starts with questions. All the work that I do starts with questions, starts with trying to understand issues that have to do with how we as humans, relate and connect to issues of public space and memory. Words that come to my mind that are significant, are memory, welcome, justice, and love. And I think of memory in its broadest sense, as it defines who we are as human beings. I'm thinking of the idea of welcome as a very key word for us as architects, to think of projects that welcome others, welcome people, how to open up, ourselves to others, to open up our houses to others. And the idea of justice is also very key, because as Dr. Martin Luther King said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. The word love is also a key word, because it has to do with the love that we have for what we do as teachers, as architects, to how to find purpose and put energies in helping this kinds of work. And I also want to invite us to consider the word love in the context of Martin Luther King's work as agape love, that is love for others, agape love. And to add, remember that Cornel West suggested to us that never forget that justice is what love looks like in public. Justice is what love looks like in public. So let me share with you the screen and begin kind of the presentation. And I will go, as I said, there are lots of slides, but I will go extremely quickly so you can see, what we're talking about. Okay, so do you see the screen? Yeah? Okay, so that's the space that we have behind me, and you have it also on the screen. So it's like a very strange situation that you have now, okay? The idea is to discuss issues that have to do with memory and public space. But I'm interested in thinking of memory in the context of the words by Andreas Huysen, that memory has to do with the present and the references of is in the past and thus absent. And also memory with Jorge Luis Borges, the Argentinian author, in Funes el Memorioso, suggested a short story about a man that was able to recall everything that happened in the universe. And because he can recall everything, he was not able to distill the meaning of things. So he said, my memory surge is like a garbage heap. So that's partly the idea. Memory, we have to work with memory because we are memory, okay? So I'm interested in thinking about memory as an action, not as an object. Memory, as a verb, not as a noun. Sorry, memory as a verb, not as a noun. I'm interested in bearing witness to difficult past, which are not just in the past, but also in the present. And you will see work that we've done with our students, not only related to the past, but also related to the present, okay? Because we have, as this series is called Hidden Truth, we have to talk truth to power. We have to think about the power structures that help us construct the world, but also separate us from others, and how do we understand our relation to the world, how we declare, how we speak, how we relate to those others who perhaps the only thing that remains is a photograph. So our work, is one that kind of I want to bring to the fore in the context of one idea, which is how we participate of society. A society that, again, with French philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, is the miracle of moving out of oneself. And that's a fundamental idea in relation to memory, moving out of oneself. To be is to remember. I don't know what happened. To be is to remember, and to think of memorials. We think of memorials as ethical, political companions. And they are environments for thinking past and present and encouraging the appearance of new critical consciousness. The idea, again, is to think about memory together. We find places, we find ourselves in the midst of space that make us recall something that goes beyond what we see. We have to engage with the world. But remembering is a vital activity, and shapes our relation with the past. We also think that few words have been so ubiquitous in contemporary culture as the word memory. Since the 1980s, a certain obsessive pursuit of memory, has taken place. And memory in its many forms is a key marker in various cultural fields, affecting information technology, psychoanalysis, historiography, performative arts, public space, and public art as well. So we know that monuments and memorials have been built around the globe, for centuries. But the atrocities and crimes and disasters of the recent past have been self-consciously inscribed in our built environment as never before in history. Memorials in places such as Hiroshima, and I'm going back, Buenos Aires, Uruguay, Montevideo, Lima, Peru, Berlin, Budapest, are dedicated to somehow commemorating complex pasts, And we think of that there's a kind of an important aspect of what we could call the culture of memory that has to do with the struggle for human rights and justice. Human rights and justice. As nations seek, these are coupled, the kind of relation between memory and struggle have been coupled as nations seek to create new democracies or perfect societies, in the context, of mass extermination, slavery, apartheid, military dictatorships, and totalitarianism. So partly what we're talking about is how do we engage with public space as a place for declaration, as a space for us to speak and come together in our present. So we see the emergence of spontaneous memorials, in pilgrimage to places of memory as well. But when we talk about memory and we talk about monuments, I think I'd like to expand just a moment on this point. When we think of public spaces in the city and monuments, usually we mean official monumental space, which, using Walter Benjamin's words, is reserved for the celebration of the history of victors. And I'd like you to keep that idea in mind, celebration of the history of victors. Cities cultivate memorials and landmarks that celebrate memory of those who perhaps have succeeded at the expense of the forgotten memory of those who have not. Many times forgets the nameless and the vanquished, victims, witnesses, and survivors of crimes against humanity. Of course, we know that there are memorials that relate to those vanquished, but what I want to kind of insist is one specific idea, that when we think of democratic public space and democracy, we can also think of how we measure, the success of democracy and indeed of public space. And they can be measured by their capacity to encourage and assist in the process of disruption, that continuity of the history of victors. Again, disrupting the continuity of history of victors. According to Hannah Arendt, political equality means visibility, and conversely, political inequality and invisibility go hand in hand. So these are projections by my design partner, Christoph Wodiczko, who we designed together the kind of memorial to the abolition of slavery in France and many other projects. And I want to stop for a second to talk about that, what we do or what we've been doing together. We are not just an artist, he's an artist and myself a designer architect, but we are also people who have suffered histories, complex histories. He comes from Poland. He was born he's a Polish Jew. He was born in hiding in the time of the Warsaw Ghetto in 1943. And I'm from the US, but also from Argentina. But my mother was born in Berlin in 1936 and barely fled Berlin, with his parents when she was 1 year old. These are the furniture stores of my grandparents and great-grandparents in Berlin. And I studied in Buenos Aires under dictatorship. This is the kind of the banner at the School of Architecture in the University of Buenos Aires, where we see a banner of all our fellow colleagues, professors, and students who were killed by the military dictatorship. And we think of them as ever present, siempre presentes. And yes, this is a place where we can have a coffee. And that relation is extremely important. The idea of commemoration has to do with life. Life keeps going and we have them in our minds all the time. And yes, we talk about architecture, we talk about the future, and we can have a coffee. So this banner is there in space for us. So the reason I mention these biographic notes are not to suggest that any of what you see or what you will see today is legitimized by my personal biography. On the contrary, the reason I mention this is because I feel obliged to contribute to the visibility of those who have been always at the margins of vision. The idea is to help the vision and the presence of others in public space. And that's an image of the memorial to the abolition of slavery, looking at the Palace of Justice, which is on the other side of the river. We'll see that later, but keep this window in mind, looking at justice. When we think of the word monument and memorials, we also think about the nature of life, the nature of life, and the word monument derives from that idea, from the verb moneo, and it means to warn, to remind, and to advise. So we can think that instead of a shape, a form of an image, monumentality may be a quality that some places have to make us recall, think, and perceive something beyond themselves, el Parque de la Memoria in Buenos Aires. The significance of these projects lies in the public dimension and dialogic character of memorial space, be that potentially permanent projects or temporary projects. Dialogic character of memorial space. Again, when we think of these projects like the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, or the project in France, they are not just transformations of public spaces, but they are affirmations of public life, affirmations in public life, places of exception, and affirmations in public space. So when we think of these projects, they raise issues that are not just architectural, but they are moral, and they are ethical, and they are philosophical. Among them, how we relate to history and to memory, and how we relate to historic trauma. So how do we convey and understand the significance of design and action in public sphere when we conceive these kinds of projects? How can we contribute to elaborate the ethical implications of Hannah Arendt's description of the public sphere as a space of appearance? How do we position ourselves as architects, teachers, students, as public intellectuals, historians, when we work on these projects? Let me turn for a moment into architecture, because I know that we have many of our colleagues who, perhaps want to hear just what we try, or I would like to share with others what we try to do. So architecture is inherently a practical and a public art. It is practical insofar that purpose is the driving force. Purpose is the driving force. It is a public art in that the presence of the work of architecture constructs the space for public appearance. The space for public appearance. Architecture involves poetic organization of matter to form purposeful, inhabitable space. Architecture occurs always as a transformation of topography and is always temporary. Yes, churches, are so-called permanent, but they are not. in the span of time in the universe. So, but projects and buildings are catalysts for the process of memory. They bring forth a depth of continuity as well as the desire for ethical transformations. They establish conversations in space and time, conversations in space and time. And here I pause for a second to express that when we designed this window, we thought that it was important from the space, underground space that you see behind me at the end of that tunnel. Oops, you see the light at the end of the tunnel? You see this window, a window that looks at the Palace of Justice, which is on the other side of the water. And we want people to think about that relation, oppression and justice, or lack of justice, one would call. But we do not express with words what we want people to think. We want to establish a conversation, but we do not tell them, please look at justice, think about the lack of justice, or other things. We want them to, we invite them to make that connection. That's why I talk about conversations in space and times, or the conversation that I use in materials when I design my house on the left, or house that I designed here in Cambridge, where we kept a brick wall and we expand the house on top. So you see what I mean? That kind of idea is what interests me, because architecture permits us to inhabit a distance that exists between action and remembrance. Action and remembrance. And the architect's historic role has been always to create a theater for action and memory, possibly to affirm life and contemplate a better future. So while we imagine projects and embark in journeys that leave traces over the skin of the earth, our work, this is a memorial in France, our work lies on anchoring histories and memories onto territories, cities, and sites. It is in the face of catastrophes and historic traumas and human injustices, that our work our work and our roles are increasingly complex, problematic, and hopefully necessary. Our work, we only hope, is necessary. But when we work on these projects professionally in academia, teaching and writing and thinking, we need to be wary of the expectation of creating instant metaphors and artificial meanings. Instant metaphor and artificial meanings. That's a space at the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. Leo Bersani has said, and I quote, "The catastrophes of history appear to matter much less if they are somehow compensated for in art." And this is an important thing. Our work is not about compensation, because neither art nor architecture can nor should attempt to compensate public trauma or mass murder. What we can do, what our practices can do, is to establish a dialogic relation with traumatic or celebratory events and help frame the process towards understanding. This is the space, that we propose in Boston Common, a space for a ground for public activism, at the kind of proposed memorial for King and Coretta Scott King. And I keep going. So we attempt, again, to inhabit a certain uninhabitable distance between ourselves and those events. So indeed, to work on this kinds of project, require an attempt to work and to transform the public sphere, involving critical ethical frameworks to position ourselves as engaged witnesses, and demands precise and dialogic committed attitudes towards design, towards techniques, materials, history, and sites, and especially towards the voices of others. You may have seen this photograph before. Former Representative Lewis. Again, this is what we're talking about, democratic public space. And democratic public space has to do with the voices, voices of others. Because as Claude Lefort suggests, democracy is based on uncertainty and is legitimized by the declaration of rights, the right to declare, to participate. Democratic public space is based on contestation, on debate, on the appearance of others. Those others that, as an enigma of a face that resists possession, cannot be fully known and can never, ever be reduced to content. The other cannot be reduced to content. Philosophers like Giorgio Agamben have theorized the position of the witness, and this is a key position that we take, as the basis of the ethical political relations insofar as the witness answers to the suffering of others without usurping the place of the other. Witnessing is a way of seeing and listening that requires an acceptance of vulnerability. It requires a renunciation of the will to mastery. For as trauma theorist Cathy Carrot argues, to bear witness over the suffering of a traumatic event is to bear witness to that event incomprehensibility. And these are desaparecidos from Argentina, killed by the military dictatorship. A project by Alfredo Jar in Chile, and names that I found in a memorial in Carpi that were deported. Or the wall across the Casa de la Memoria in Guatemala, where I was giving some talks and working with the community. Again, all of this has to do with how we work when we want to respond to the suffering of others. These views, are important because perhaps the only thing we can do is to breathe your name. Respiro tu nombre, to breathe your name. And yes, we have to name the name of George Floyd as projected, here at the Robert E. Lee Memorial in Richmond. And yes, this is the memorial of Nantes at the George Floyd March. The honor that I have, let's say, at some level, I have created that space that has become, a place for activism, in the present. That was a few months ago, as you can see. So in a certain way, what we're trying to do with our work is to sort of make room for the voices of others to appear in public space without attempting to speak for them. Because as James Baldwin reminds us, the questions that one asks oneself begin at least to illuminate the world and becomes one key to the experience of others, a key to the experience of others. Again, the word freedom as inscribed in the memorial in 47 languages. The king in Coreta King, projections in Tijuana, and you will see these images over and over and over. Because partly the concept is that to remember, we have to reenact. We go back and forth in our time. So our approach involves inhabiting distance, the distance that exists between remember and action.
Il a voulu s'engager comme soldat pendant la Deuxième Guerre mondiale. Il a voulu s'engager comme soldat pendant la Deuxième Guerre mondiale. Dans la Légion étrangère.
Finalement, j'ai réussi
Par
à
la Légion
téléphoner.
étrangère.
Il a été débarqué. On m'a appris qu'il avait
Il a été
été
démobilisé.
au cadre. On m'a appris qu'il avait été.
Quand il est revenu, il a été dénoncé.
De là, je suis monté à Paris.
Il a été déporté à Auschwitz.
So as I continue, please tell me if you see that image. What I want to kind of assert here is, yes, presence and authorship with the idea that we remove ourselves and we create spaces for those voices to be heard. What you heard was a kind of a sound composition by my mother, who's an electroacoustic composer that still works at her 84 young years old, years young, let's say, and it's basically kind of voices and testimonies of survivors of the Holocaust. And you see again the memorial in France. So I'll continue with this. You see, so the goal of these projects is somehow to remove ourselves from the scene, not to be seen, but to be, but to offer those spaces, those spaces that can welcome and to illuminate kind of presence of others. So you see, this is the attitude that I bring to my teaching, to my work, and to my, also kind of advocacy. For example, I am part of the kind of symbolic reparations research project, that you see on the left. I was also participant, one of the speakers at the University and Slavery Bound by History conference at Radcliffe University. I had the honor to sort of be able to speak and to share some ideas here, and also has to do with the work that we do here at school, kind of at Roger Williams with slavery and slave trade. So our students work on memory maps, our projects deal with history of the state, memory boxes, as you can see. I'm just going very quickly. So we think about the past, but we also think about the present. Again, the waters of Rhode Island, and again, we ask our students to consider the same question that I ask myself in every single project. The questions that one asks oneself begin at least to illuminate the world and becomes one key to the experience of others, as James Baldwin suggested. So we use words, we want to think, and we want to think about the significance, of the fact that 55% of mill workers in Rhode Island by 1830 were children. How do we assess this? So some of our recent grads working on these projects, Skylar Moncada, Evan Cordova or Ken Mendes, working with this kind of a understanding of the potential of graphic to tell a story, and they work on projects, they deal with sites, they design projects, as you see, kind of architectural spaces that convey meaning and convey messages, as we try to do through our work. As you see here, montages, you may recognize this mansion, Linden Place, montage done by Dan Fredlund long time ago with Kara Walker's images. So when I look at these projects, and I show very quickly images like the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies is a small library next to a historic house, connected with a specific conversation of materials, lines, and relations. And the interior opens to the old house, to that courtyard. You see, an empty space for conversation, an empty space for discussion. And those two windows with a zinc-clad box, that recall, the kind of dormers of the house, are part of that story. The National Holocaust Monument in Canada, that we were one of 6 finalists, was basically an excavation on a site. The NMHM site that you see across from the kind of Canadian War Museum. And we proposed basically to excavate the totality of the site to find what we call the Canadian bedrock. We had information and we had details of the kind of level of that. And the project basically was an excavation to find the Canadian bedrock, the limestone bedrock. And in the bedrock, we planted trees. So the concept was to plant this grove of aspen trees that would recall the idea of life in a place where only 5,000 Jews were allowed to enter from 1833 and 48. So Canada at that time was probably one of the most anti-Semitic countries. As far as I heard from my family, they applied to Canada and they were denied entry. So luckily they were able to get to Argentina, as I showed you before. So the project is about the ground, and you will see that most of my work deals with ground, because I think that ground can tell stories. A ground can tell stories. And that has to do with Rhode Island, has to do with Nantes, or has to do with the image of Auschwitz, as you see here. Again, the ground can tell stories. The project for Martin Luther King is another form of ground, is a ground for activism. And we call the project that we've done with my dear friend Marianne Thompson and with great landscape architect Walter Hood, along with Christoph and myself, we call the project the Ripple Effects. I won't get into lots of details, but we call this a ground for activism. And you'll hear the voices of King and Coretta as I walk you through this project. I hope it will work. The Ripple Effects.
Of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read. I would like to share with you some notes taken from my husband's pocket. Of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read. I simply read them to you of as the freedom of press. Somewhere I read. And I quote. That the greatness of America is the right to protest far right. 10 Commandments on Vietnam. A way to hold this turn us around. We aren't going to let any injunction turn us around.
So you see the site, we call the Ripple Effects, the memorial ground, the mound, the bridge, different elements that have to do with this project. So what you heard, again, is just their voices, because we think that it's important to understand this space as a ground for public activism. To hear their voices, to hear the bells ringing, committed to public life and to public space, and the idea that we see ourselves reflected on the glass of the text that you saw by civil rights leaders, including, Angela Davis, and John Lewis, and, and again, King and Coretta. And we thought that it's important to understand our presence in the world, accompanied or participating of the world with others. So the project is not just a memorial, it's a ground for public activism. And the memorial has a public life, everyday site experience, gathering for circles, screen projections, guest speakers, or march, as we do in Boston when we march, the March Against the Guns or March for Our Lives, along, and in front of the State House. So the idea is to embody the concept is that freedom is never really won. You earn it and win it with each generation. So again, King talking about love, and Coretta's King talking about the fact that we need to earn freedom in each generation. So let me just quickly go to the memorial to the abolition of slavery, that entails a kind of a complex challenge as it weaves together multiple threads about the memory of slavery, abolition, and the present as well. We want to invite people to think about past and present in this space. So you see the image, the montages that we've done, and the reality of the space that transforms the coast of the Loire River. Our client, as you will hear in a few minutes, him speak, was the kind of mayor of the city, Jean-Marc Ayrault, that then became French prime minister. And I want to quote him. He says that this memorial is a genuine act, a genuine call to us all to remember past struggles in order to project ourselves into the future, fighting against all modern forms of slavery and denial of human rights in order to build a more united world. So by building the memorial in the banks of the Loire River, in the heart of the city, we recall the fact that the struggle for freedom and dignity is a fundamental cause linked to our vision of society. You see again society as a miracle of moving out of oneself, and the idea of a memorial as a political project. The memorial transforms the coast of the Loire River, as you see on the plan, the red line, the port, the old port that was then became kind of almost like a parking. And you can see here the building across the water, that's the Palace of Justice that you see there, and the memorial that is about 400 meters, that's about 4 football fields long. And that's a relation that exists between the History Museum of Nantes and a walk that marks the places where the slave traders lived and the history of places around the city. So the whole ground of the city is a memorial. And the memorial is an underground space that was discovered by the kind of transformation of the kind of construction of the port of the embankments of 18th, 19th, and 20th century. And you will see it now. You see, it was a parking with mud below, and we transformed this into an inhabitable space. You see the diagrams. You see, it was like the notion of a discovery before and after. We have to discover these spaces, and every city has a ground and an underground that can tell stories. You see the before and after again. So what I'm trying to suggest with these projects that has to do with how we see the world. And this project makes sense specifically when people are walking, when people are reading, when people are thinking. The glass that you see here is a glass that has inscribed 46 text declarations against slavery about 4 centuries, and go from Toussaint Louverture, to Bob Marley, just to give you an example. You see, and Derek Walcott, Toni Morrison, Martin Luther King, but the ground basically is cut, is interrupted. And this is partly this connection that I told you about, interrupting the history of victors. This is partly the kind of concept of this project, which is to disrupt a public space. Of course, we explained it a bit differently, but the concept was to transform what we see in the city. That parking became a public space, and the glass, that is a very strange glass that does not reflect, as seen in different moments of the day, you see, and from different angles. And this is a public space for people to walk and to think. But we also thought of the ground of the city as an archive, as a public archive, an archive that can tell us stories about this place, these ships. About half of all French expeditions, slave trade expeditions, came from Nantes, about 2,000. Just to give an example, Rhode Island was about 1,000 slave trade expeditions. So Nantes included this sort of story. So we invited people to look at the ground and to think about something very strange, but very difficult to grasp, which is the beauty of names. The beauty of names that below them has a word. Navire négrier means slave ship, or slave for enslaved humans, we would really say. But this name, La Thérèse, is one of them. There's another slave ship that is called L'Amour. Can you believe that there's a French slave trade ship that's called Love? And you begin to see that the ground can tell stories. So this ground, I found my grandmother's name, who escaped from Germany, Charlotte. Lot was my grandmother's name. And then you go underground and you find yourself immersed by the wall of the 18th and 19th century, the embankment wall, and the concrete that we designed, for the memorial. But this project started with an intuition, and this is an important part, an intuition of a space that we did not know existed. Because I sent this sketch because I wanted to excavate the totality of the space, that I saw. And then I got information that we got information that the space existed. That was product of constructing the port of the 18th, 19th, and 20th century. So the project became to adapt this space. No one told us use the space. We proposed to use it. And that's construction, a very complex construction, because the water changes levels about 4 meters, that's 12 feet twice a day. So you're immersed in the structure of 1910. You see the concrete and you see the glass that cuts the structure. And then, on the right, you see the dam that we had to construct so that the water does not get into the space. You see, before construction and after. But the project, as I said before, makes sense when people are using it. It's not just a space. It's a space for conversations, a space for action, a space for debate, a space for quiet commemoration. It's a space for thinking. It's a space that transforms the city during the day and at night. And very special moments like the day of the opening that you'll see in a minute. The day of the opening and very special moments that we see here at the main entrance of the staircase. You see the same staircase you see here, as seen on the other direction, where the words from the United Nations 1948 Declaration of Human Rights, the Article 4, that says no one shall be held in slavery or servitude. Slavery and slave trade shall be prohibited in all forms. Those declarations are important. When we read this, we think about the meaning of declaring, the meaning of speaking in public, and that has to do with open up spaces for voices and sounds. There's a sound project that I won't be able to show here that has to do with sounds. But I want to show you something that is connected to the way we think of space. You see the glass here, it does not reflect. Through our computer studies, we tested glass that reflect, and we realized that it was important to create a glass that did not reflect so that the text itself could be the kind of a subject of light. The text in silver enamel that reads and tells us a story, and the glass quiets down the space. So you see, we go from concepts to materials. And this is, to me, one of the things that we do as architects. But concepts to materials make sense again as someone is reading the words oppression. And we go back to the site and we see it at dusk. You see the transformation of the ground of the city. And we'll go back and see names, and we move and the name changes. We see names, Happy Mary, New Love, and you move around. And I want to celebrate this moment, which is the moment of construction of any project, because we have to understand that none of what we do as architects, as thinkers, is possible without caring hands. Love thy hands, Toni Morrison has inscribed at the memorial. And I want to pay homage to the people who build our buildings, to build our public spaces. Yes, I designed the method of construction, but I was not able to do it. You see the plaques on the ground, as you see here, or the excavation, or the transformation of this public space, sealing, and cutting the concrete and opening to that building on the other side of the water, which is the Palace of Justice, or sliding precast concrete, which is about 7 tons in weight, to craft a perfect wall that has not even a single centimeter of change. You see what I mean? There's something about precision in what we do as architects, but it's also something about the power of love of people doing the right thing in terms of the work. And the work is connected to the water, as I said before, the tidal change of the water, and the water that comes in when it rains, and the water that marks the presence of words, you know, and details of construction, and details of that wood floor that we designed, but we did not tell, you know, the construction, you know, workers to cut the wood this way. They did it because they loved the project, and they still go to the project to bring them families with them. You see the relation between old and new, a concrete that is cut and a stone that is cut, you see, and words that are inscribed in the glass. And the glass that cuts the ground, and the other part of the memorial, which is that kind of a, almost like a kind of a landscape project that brings us to that esplanade. You see, the landscape project as you see it, that brings us to the esplanade where the George Floyd March took place a few months ago. And the project is above the ground and below the ground. And the project invites visitors every day, schools, kids, university, reading, writing, and thinking about the meaning of this place, you know. And these are my two sons a while ago, Martin and Manuel, who are, you know, a bit older now, when they were visiting with me the memorial for the first time. And my visit with my father, who still is with us in Buenos Aires, and he's an architect, you know, and we visited the memorial a few years ago, you know, and I was very proud of this moment, you know, to be able to visit with my father this place, you see. So part of these projects have to do with the kind of work that took about 10 years of time, you know, and working with my design partner, Christoph Odichko, you know, and working with the mayor of the city and then Prime Minister Jean-Marc Ayrault, as you will hear in a minute. But this moment is very significant, but I'm also moved and perhaps even more kind of passionate about these particular moments in our work. You see, people embracing and thinking and reading. And former student of Roger Williams, you know, one of my first students at Roger Williams, Tom Long, who designed the project with us, and now he's professor of architecture at the 5 colleges in Western Massachusetts, when he was visiting the memorial with me, reading the words by Martin Luther King. You see, a public space, a public memorial, during the rain, during the day, at night. The memorial, as seen from the Palace of Justice, you see that horizontal line that cuts the ground and interrupts the public space, somehow to declare there's something different happening here below ground. Not everybody sees the memorial. And the memorial, as the Palace of Justice, as seen from the memorial. So that conversation that I was telling you about, a conversation in space and time, is a key for this project. Again, the word memory and the word oppression. And that moment, that very special moment where I heard the footsteps of this little boy running to his mother. And I saw that embrace, and I said, I have to share that idea with all of you, which is to share the fact that architecture can have the power to affect and to invite emotions, thinking, declaration, activism, and action. So I'd like to stop here for a second, and if you would indulge me for 5 more minutes or 4 more minutes, I'd like to share a movie. Would that be okay? A 4-minute movie? Please, yeah? Okay. So please tell me if you see the movie full screen. Can you see it? And you will hear the voice of the mayor.
Plus de 27 000 expéditions négrières ont été recensées au départ des ports européens entre le 15e et le 19e siècle. Elles arrachèrent plus de 12,5 millions d'hommes, femmes et enfants à la terre d'Afrique pour les réduire en esclavage en Amérique et aux Antilles. Plus d'1,5 million de personnes moururent pendant la traversée.
You see drawings, construction drawings, our visit to the construction. and people walking, people thinking, people discussing. Very special moment again, that wall that I told you about, and the transformation of the space into inhabitable space. The discovery of a space and the transformation into inhabitable space. The sketch, 2003, and the project that took about 10 years to be realized. And a very special moment when you see the reflection of the water into the ceiling or onto the ceiling of the memorial. You see when the sun is up in the morning, the memorial vibrates.
L'esclave de l'esclavage est celui qui ne veut pas savoir. Édouard Glissant.
The day of the opening, and you'll hear Mr. Jean-Marc Ayrault.
La lutte contre toutes les formes d'oppression, d'esclavage, d'exploitation humaine, de discrimination, ça reste un combat d'aujourd'hui. Comprendre notre histoire, comprendre les mécanismes de l'histoire, ça nous donne davantage d'élan, ça nous donne davantage de force pour le faire.
So what he's saying is to understand the mechanisms of history will allow us to continue the fight for a better world. And this is what we need to do today in our school, in our university, in our public life, in our public engagement with projects, is to continue the fight, the struggle for a better world. Because as Coretta King suggested, freedom is won every generation. Every generation. And that is the moment of the opening of the memorial.
Nous ne sommes pas tournés vers le passé, nous sommes tournés vers le présent et l'avenir. Et le mémorial est un lieu à la fois pour se souvenir, pour comprendre, mais c'est aussi un lieu pour réfléchir pour aujourd'hui.
This idea of reflection is what interested us. You see,
Je me dis que c'est horrible, tous les gens qui sont morts dans cette souffrance et les enfants qui sont obligés de travailler.
Je lance ici, de Nantes, aujourd'hui, un appel solennel à tous les citoyens français à lutter sans faiblesse contre toute forme de racisme, d'antisémitisme, contre toute forme d'esclavage et d'exploitation de l'être humain dans le monde.
and you see the opening to the Palace of Justice, as I was telling you. So the concept here, I'm going to stop. The concept here, again, is to engage with kind of this notion, that this memorial, can serve to illuminate our present. And once we illuminate our present, once we illuminate the past shed lights over us. And when the past shed lights over us, it makes us responsible for what we see. What I always try to suggest to our students and to myself is that we cannot unsee what we see. We cannot unsee what we saw, which means that we have to take responsibility for that. When we see oppression, we need to fight against it. When we see injustice, we need to fight against it. Because, with James Baldwin, and I'm going to quote him from, James Baldwin says, "Not everything is lost. Responsibility cannot be lost. It can only be abdicated. If one refuses abdication, one begins again." And that's partly a history of humankind, our humanity striving to be better. One begins again. And yes, we create spaces for thinking and for emotions. We create spaces where people will inhabit and discuss and debate. We'll establish a relation between past and present. But again, we take responsibility. We take responsibility before our fellow citizens, because that's what we do when we create these projects. And that's what we do when we teach. when we teach, we take responsibility because it's an ethical responsibility to speak with others who come to us in search for something that perhaps they don't know. So our task is to establish a conversation, the same way that I'm trying to establish, or we're trying a conversation here with justice or the lack of justice, a conversation of materials. It's the same kind of conversation we establish in our classrooms. It's the same kind of conversations that I always establish with my friends, clients, when I design a house or when I design a project or a memorial, is to understand our position in the world and to try to make it better. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Julian. And I'm pleased to say that the questions have already begun. So we'll take a few moments to deliver some of those to you for your further reflection. Edgar's asking, you talk about the importance of memory in everyday life. And do you feel that the space for memory is being eroded or expanded by technology that allows for the immediate recall of an event in a digital form?
Thanks, Edgar, for that question. I think it's quite interesting. I think it is both. You know, we have the capacity to store memories in our phones, let's say, or things like, but we may be losing a certain capacity to recall ourselves. So for me, what is important is to try to expand that capacity in our students, you know, and in ourselves, you know, by creating memory exercises, by exercising memory at some level, you know. But we also know that memory is just it's just an incredibly powerful word and idea that we as humans have, you know, the capacity to recall. And yes, as I spoke before, is also connected in many cases to traumatic histories. But we think of memory, you know, in many ways, you know, and it's interesting because I didn't have time to get into all this, but memory has to do with questions of cognition, has to do with cultural and religious traditions, you know, the question of anamnesis, or the kind of imprint, you know, that Plato talked about. You know, St. Augustine talked about the idea of inwardness, you know, the question of identity and self that come from, you know, Locke, collective memory, you know. So we can think of memory and its distortions. So as we can also think about the idea of vicarious memories, which is quite important because we have not, perhaps, memory is not directly connected to experience, but is connected to what we learn and how we learn through books, through movies, you know. So I have, you know, the memory of the Holocaust that I have perhaps is passed on by my family, you know, or the books that I read, or the movies that I saw, you know, or the memories about, you know, the history of enslaved people is not something that I experienced personally. Yet I'm still striving to try to understand and not to speak for others. So see, to me, that's partly kind of this process, is to understand that we have to make room for others to speak without attempting to speak for them. You see, that's partly the idea of illuminating the past and take responsibility for what we see.
Thank you for that. After Edgar's question, I see mainly praise, well-deserved. Edgar offers a comment about that makes the idea of shared memory all the more important. I might ask a question myself, which has to do with some thoughts that are only coming up for me now about the way in which, you know, efforts to memorialize in particular places for all the rich value that you've outlined and really persuasively described, you know, might also at the same time bear some risk of, you know, allowing for a sort of, how do I want to put this? A kind of location in space or a location in time, you know. So for instance, when I lived in France for a few years at the beginning of this century, it made a big difference for a lot of the people that I knew who were primarily, you know, educated, sort of middle class white French people that racism was a thing in the Americas, right? They had a lot of opinions about racism in the Americas, but I would say much more resistance to trying to interrogate systemic racism in, the Paris of the year 2001 than, even I think today the kinds of difficulty in thinking about that in US society. So is there risk in having a particular place that marks, for instance, the slave trade as the place and the time, right, where we confront racism and allowing it to kind of concretize around those particular things, rather than following that legacy out into all of these sort of smaller and more intangible ways in which it sort of infuses contemporary life and politics.
I think, Jason, that's a very, 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 very important question. And I think we need both, because we need places for us to, investigate, interrogate, debate, and discuss, as much as we need transformative actions in our daily life. We need both. And I do believe that has to do with kind of like an ethical dimension. Look, we have a problem, from both for architects and for historians and cultural activists, which has to do with partly the meaning of historiography, let's say, which has to do with projection of meaning over those others who did not have the chance to speak for themselves. So we project meaning sometimes retrospectively, and that is an ethical problem both for architects and for historians as well. How we write history, how we read history, has to do with that. So the question is, how do we allow those voices, let's say, not to speak for them, but to interrupt our present in a certain way, to disrupt our present? And that's what some of these projects tried to do. And I didn't show many more. Let's say the Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King project was to create a ground for activism. That is to create in the middle of the Boston Common, the oldest park in America, nest there a place for public activism. We thought that honoring King and Coretta King was not to put a sculpture there, but to invite public and publics to reflect, to debate, to discuss, and to act. In the project in Nantes is somehow similar, because I do believe that there's a relation between memory and space that is really important. And we can go back, and you can all go back in your own histories and think of significant events in your own lives. And I many times do this exercise with my students, or when I give talks. We didn't do it today, which is to invite all of you or all of us to think about significant events in our lives. And then try to identify that event and look at the space around it. And what is the quality of that space? And that space is important, because events are not happening in a vacuum. You see, this site in Nantes is the old port, the port from which more than 2,000 expeditions, slave trade expeditions, departed. And the wealth of the city came through that port. So to mark that site as a site for struggle, not just only commemoration, but a struggle, debate, action, was important. That's partly what we tried to do. Because again, it's partly that interruption of a history of victors that concerns me. And one can make the case, and I would be remiss not to say, that this is a project that is embedded, in kind of a power structures of the city. Of course, it was approved by the city council, it was supported by the mayor, but we can look at it cynically, or we can look at it as a chance to transform the history of a city. And I prefer to do the latter, because once we engage in a kind of cynical vision of politics, we end up where we are today, here. But if we engage with a kind of vision of politics that allows for spaces to be transformed and occupied, It's not a small thing to transform 4 football fields long in the center of a city and a space that is dedicated to commemorate, in part, the complicit situation or the complicit history of a city. So that goes long response to the fact that we need both, you know.
Yeah, I heartily agree. And I was thinking too, there's so much about, you know, the beauty of the names of the slave ships and the way that that's a prompt for a kind of uncomfortable, you know, there's one of the ways that somebody like Derrida has talked about, you know, memory and, you know, is this sort of haunting, right? It might be good to have haunted spaces with ghosts that follow you home. It's after 8, so why don't we decide that we can stop with this final question, which is whether or not there were other civic spaces that seem to you to be good precedents for the memorial in Nantes. If there were other particular memorials perhaps that you had in mind.
Yeah, thanks again. That's a great question. I think it's important because, again, we don't work on a vacuum. We learn from our experiences in space, and we're struck by the presence of things that we perhaps do not even think. I showed you very quickly an image of a vertical window in an old wall of Aigues Mortes, you know, and a vertical window that I designed at the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. And suddenly, after designing that window, I realized I have seen that, you see. And partly this project comes from a certain obsession of mine, which is to excavate. Perhaps, you know, in another life I was an archaeologist, I don't know, you know, but it comes from the idea of excavation. And it comes from also from understanding the significance perhaps of memorials like the Vietnam Memorial, where the ground is transformed to reveal the presence of that wall, you know, the kind of with names. That is one case. Another case that is important is the one that I showed you kind of at the beginning, which was this white wall, you know, with people coming down the staircase. And that's the memorial of the deportation in Paris. It was a 1962 project by Georges-Henri Pingousson, and it's at the end of the Ile de la Cité behind Notre Dame. And not many people know about that space, you know, and I visited many times that space, and the notion of immersing oneself in the ground is what interested me in that particular project. So there are many projects that I've done, you know, on precedents of my own work that I've done that deal with water, like a project for Coney Island that I've done long time ago with a building in the water, you know, or projects like, you know, an excavation in Buenos Aires dealing with a kind of the desaparecidos, or the ruins of the kind of AMIA, which was the Jewish community center that was bombed in 1994. You know, so for me, there's always something about the ground that can tell stories, because we learn about the world through our feet. We learn about the world through our feet. And the fact that we can walk and we have a horizon means that we have the chance to project ourselves into the future. Many of the people who were enslaved were horizontally enslaved, you know, in the ships. You know, they didn't see anything. They couldn't see anything. You know, so the question of visibility becomes also important. And I want to sort of perhaps close this question by saying that partly the work that we try to do is to unearth, to reveal things that may not be visible. Because, you know, as Ralph Ellison said, you know, and you know, I am a man, that has to do with visibility, you know. And for me, the question of making visible or making visibly visible injustices and inequality is a way to work towards making the world better. And our work tries to do that. Whether we accomplish something or not remains to be seen, but we try to do that. Again, to illuminate the past so that the past sheds light over us. Once we see that, we cannot not see it. And that makes us responsible, not to speak for the past, but to let the past speak in our world today. And that's why, to me, the Legacies project, dealing, you know, with the history of enslavement, you know, and oppression, you know, is still is a key project to work together at the university and to work with, with our students and to work, hopefully with our colleagues and communities around not only the state of Rhode Island, but in the US and other places in the world. So that's a long response. But to me, perhaps just to conclude, the idea is not that memory is understood, as a construction of knowledge over the past. That's kind of more history. Memory is not about construction of identity, national, party identity. It's not just about, social cohesion, It's not just an activation of emotion. What I'm interested is in the alliance that exists between ethics and memory, which is to allow the call, the sound and the voices of victims of the past, victims of human hate, whose voices have been silenced for so long, to let that sound be a resounding sound in our present, in our midst. You see, it's not a history of victors. Again, it's memory of victims, but victims that are not victims because they have agency. And I want to also to celebrate the agency of people that fought for the freedom, that created a culture, that was embedded in life. Life making is extremely important, and we have to celebrate that. For me, that's where we say with Baldwin, and I close with this: yes to life. As Baldwin said, yes to life every day, even in the midst of our pandemic and in the midst of the situation we're living in the United States and in the world. We have to affirm life, because that's what we do as teachers, that's what we do as architects, and that's what we do as cultural agents. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Julian. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Thanks to all of you for being a part of our ongoing series of Hidden Truths. I think this has been an excellent example of what exactly we're trying to get at in bringing together so many opportunities to think hard about how we can address ourselves to that which requires our acknowledgement in order to live more ethically, as you prompted us to reflect on in the world as it is today. So thanks very much, and we will see you next time.
Bye, everybody. Thank you for
Good night, everybody.
the time.
Thank you so much.